My background is a mechanical engineer, but I think most engineers just intrinsically don't really understand or like sales and marketing. In fact, a lot of engineers, we shy away from it. We don't want to put ourselves out there. We don't want to do even humble brags, like, oh, this thing that we did was so great, even in a humble way.
You're listening to Breaking BizDev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Breaking BizDev. I'm Mark, and I'm joined, as always, by John. John, how are you today?
Mark, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Well, aren't we just all pleasant today? No,
right.
Yeah, we're great. We're great, and we have three guest voices who are also great. They were nice enough to join us today. We're going to recap some recent interviews that you had with three people that you know. They are business owners. They are consultants. They have some perspectives on what is broken in business development. And I think these three are specifically, or at least their backgrounds are in engineering and architecture and construction. So that sort of AEC world. And, let's dig into it, John. So you spoke with, and I'll let you riff a little bit because you know these folks, right? You spoke with Aaron Moncur, you spoke with Leslie Blaize, and you spoke with Perryn Olson.
Yeah, so folks that are listening to this podcast episode right now, you can check out the full interviews with Aaron, Leslie, and Perryn if you want to go to the Breaking BizDev YouTube page. We've got those videos up there. And so, yeah, Mark, the kind of impetus behind this episode was we wanted to really understand and get some guest voices around what's broken around AEC, right? We did an episode a few months ago, maybe it's been longer than that, focused on the accounting industry. And we thought, well, hey, there's lots of great ideas and perspectives across different professional services industries. So let's go and see what's broken in AEC. And, there are some similarities. There are some differences. But I think folks are going to find it interesting to hear from these people's perspectives. So I'm excited about this one.
Good. As am I. And yes, this is our fun question that we have posed over time. What is broken about business development in your experience, right? In your world. And we've asked this to people in the past. We have previous episodes. If this type of episode is of interest to you, you can go back and listen to some of those previous episodes. I'm sure we'll have those linked in the show notes, John. And we will continue to do this in the future. We've got some I think we've got some folks lined up for the future. But anybody listening, who has a particularly interesting, maybe even spicy perspective on what's broken in business development, let us know. You're welcome to come on in and share your perspective. This is the way that John and I like to incorporate or include people in Breaking BizDev. We don't do a ton of guest interviews, but we like to bring new guest voices in, so we have some fun with this. Do you want to give a little sort of 30-second on Aaron?
Aaron is the owner of Pipeline Design and Engineering. They help manufacturers of hard good products. Aaron is the host of the Being an Engineer podcast. So I know that we have some engineering folk out there that listen to the show. So I wanted to talk to Aaron because I think what he's doing with his firm is very marketing forward, and it's very innovative on the marketing side of things. So he's got a podcast, and then he has a community, and he's doing in-person events. He's hosting events. And so it's a very interesting marketing mix, and one that I think helps Aaron and his team punch well above their weight class.
Okay. So here's at least a little bit of John's conversation with Aaron.
On these interviews, I like to start with a big question and we can kind of drill down from there. Take it in any direction that you want. But from your perspective, what do you think is the number one thing that's broken about the way engineering firms go about new business development?
I think primarily it's the fact that we're engineers and we don't understand marketing and sales. And that's true for myself, even though I've been primarily involved in sales and marketing and business development for the past, I'd say 5 years or so. I mean, my background is a mechanical engineer. That's what I went to school for. That's what I did for my day-to-day work for a long time. But I think most engineers just intrinsically don't really understand or like sales and marketing. In fact, a lot of engineers, we shy away from it. We don't want to put ourselves out there. We don't want to, what's the term that I heard recently? We don't want to do even humble brags, like, oh, this thing that we did was so great, even in a humble way. But I think you have to a little bit when you're doing sales and marketing. So I think the mindset of an engineer, generally speaking, is just not really aligned with what it needs to be in order to succeed at sales and business development.
You obviously see the value in marketing and investing in marketing and building a media arm of your business. Why is that such a focus for you?
We've attended some large trade shows in the past in an attempt to generate more visibility for our company, right, as a sales and marketing tool. I mean, lots of people do this, right? It's a pretty typical effort for companies to participate in marketing. And we spent a lot of money at this one trade show in particular. We attended as an exhibitor for 5 years, and it cost us, after you factor in everyone's time and travel expenses and things like that, it was costing us around 25 grand a year to be at this show. And I committed to doing it for 5 years. I said, I'm going to, let's see what happens, right? I'm not just going to go 1 year and call it quits if we don't get a bunch of work out of it. So we went for 5 years and really didn't get hardly anything out of it. And we were just, a small little guppy in a sea of much bigger fish at this trade show. Of course, there were smaller companies like us there as well, but we just kind of got lost there. I think, it was so big and there was so much going on, and there wasn't a lot of enough focus on us. And I thought, where is it that engineers hang out? Where do I go to get eyeballs from engineers? And like, a trade show is one place, but where else could we go? And there wasn't like a great answer to that. There's some conferences, but podcasts, engineers listen to some podcasts. So I started thinking, what could we do as a company to own the engine that attracts engineers' attention, right? So we started this podcast, Being an Engineer. That was kind of the beginning of what you referred to as our media arm. And we've since informally, at least internally, started referring to that as the Pipeline Media Group. And we'll start formally branding or putting that brand out there more and more as we continue. But we started the podcast, and we're in season 6 now, and we've done close to 350 episodes at this point. And that's been a really tremendous tool for us. And what we've learned is that the business we've acquired from the podcast is not so much from listeners who are tuning in and listening, consuming that content, but it's actually been more from the guests that we have on the show. And sometimes these guests are chosen strategically. They're people I'd like to do business with, and having them on the podcast as a guest is just a great way to start building that reputation without, in a low pressure environment. And other times, the guests on the show are just interesting people in the engineering community that end up somehow leading to some kind of paid engagement with my company. So the podcast has been really helpful there. And then we, a few years ago, started an online community called thewave.engineer. And that's a community of tools, education for engineers. And it's a place they can go and they can connect with other engineers. Most recently, we started PDX, the Product Development Expo. And this is an in-person event. The format that we've created there is a little bit different than your typical trade show. So instead of showing up and just, talking with a vendor and getting a flyer or something like that, each exhibitor at the event is contractually required to do formal training for attendees. So we've got training on, like 50 different topics at this event. So all these different efforts that we've been working on, the podcast, the wave.engineer community website, PDX, these are all intended to be like our business development engine, right? Because pipeline is at the center of all these things. And so instead of paying other people to send engineering eyeballs our way, we're creating our own ecosystem platform that engineers want to engage with, because we're providing really interesting, unique, and valuable content, tools, education, community. And that's been the strategy, to just build out this ecosystem that drives our marketing, instead of being a really small fish in a giant pond like we were at this one trade show.
I thought when Aaron phrased his reluctance to make humble brags, I thought that was a really interesting point, because humble brags, and to use his words, is like just relevant case examples, is what you and I would say, right? So when you're having those conversations, it's okay to talk about past work that you've done if it's relevant to the conversation, if it's relevant, if it's helpful to the client. Finding ways to share those relevant case stories, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, that was interesting. He kind of went that way. And it's actually funny that it connects a little bit to what one of our other guests is going to talk about today. But yeah, so I can see how engineers can, feel it's a little awkward or uncomfortable to be talking about themselves, which is actually kind of an interesting, good indicator. I think it shows me that people out there appreciate sort of having a low self-orientation, which is really important. But I think communicating past experience, through client success stories, little snippets, whatever else, just relaying relevant information to your clients or prospective clients or just your audience is important. So yeah, nice perspective from Aaron.
All right, so let's move on to our next guest voice.
Yeah, Leslie Blaize. You had a nice conversation with Leslie. We appreciate her talking about storytelling. I think that's a lot what she talked about.
Yeah, Leslie is a freelance writer who serves AEC firms. We talked about the importance of storytelling, and that it is something that is such a powerful tool that can be used to develop new business, but it's currently not being taken advantage of. And so that was kind of the focus of our conversation around why stories are important, why it's broken, and then how firms can incorporate more storytelling in their business development.
Here is John and Leslie Blaize.
On the Breaking BizDev podcast, we like to shine a light on what's broken about the ways that architecture, engineering, construction firms go about winning new business today. So, Leslie, I'd love to understand from your perspective, why do you think storytelling is something that's broken among these firms specifically?
Well, first, I want to start out by saying that I really respect the professionals of the AEC firms. They're amazing, they're talented, they add to the quality of life for clients and their users of different facilities. But in their emphasis, it's always often on the technical side of, how projects were solved. And what I argue is that, if you want to build, human connections, is you've got to use the storytelling to relate to your clients and prospects. So, of course they want to hire you because you're technically advanced and know how to solve their problems, but they also want to like you. They want to know, like, and trust you and know that they can work with you and it's going to be a great experience. And stories can do that, project stories about how you went the extra mile. They can show how you'll be a delight to work with. And also, let's face it, people, listen to the logic, they listen to the data, but they purchase with their emotions and they want to feel connected with you. And then you could use stories in a variety of ways, but that's one thing. It's like, hey, AEC firms out there, stories are important. When you hear a story, what happens to it? Maybe you use it at one client presentation and then it, goes away and that person disappears. But are you saving those stories? And even more important, are you seeking out those stories? Are you recognizing, are you at the top saying, hey, these stories are important. We need to encourage our clients to talk about them and to save them and to record them so that we can use them and help our bottom line.
100%. And you're speaking my language. I'm a big proponent of storytelling. In fact, it's one of the, I was doing some research on the history of podcasting, and, you can go as far back as, radio was introduced in the late 1800s, and, people are used to listening to voices on the radio. But I think it extends, well beyond that. Like, storytelling was how knowledge and information was passed down from generation to generation, well before hieroglyphics even, right? So we're wired as humans to learn and want to learn through stories.
People remember stories. If you have a client interview, and if you're being smart about it, then when you're preparing your presentation, you're saying, okay, what are some good stories about this project? Or even what are stories from other projects that may not be related, but they show that you know how to meet a timeline, or you can deal with various challenges. As a prospect, I want to know that you know how to handle challenges. And I'm going to remember if you tell a cool story about an engineer driving through the night to deliver a project, or to deliver a part. You know what? I'm going to remember that. Hey, you guys are dedicated. You care. Or I'll tell another story of a mechanical engineer who went to a construction site of a building on Christmas weekend. It was like maybe Christmas Eve day or something. And he found frozen pipes. And he, called somebody and they solved that. And if he hadn't made that inspection, the client could have had lots of damage that would cause a lot. So do you think as a prospect, you're going to remember that story? Yes, you are.
Well, and it conveys that, they're on top of it. And even on Christmas, they're looking and checking and to see if there's frozen pipes. And so that story that you just shared conveyed a focus on the client, customer satisfaction, right? All the things that firms like to say, we understand our clients, but that story shows it. And
then in this world of AI, you're answering a proposal, and a lot of people can put the same prompts, but you own your stories, even if it's maybe a few sentences. I know proposals are tight and you don't have a lot of room, but you can find a way to say, this community had rotten water, and because of our water treatment plant, now they have pure, delightful water coming out of their taps, and it's, changed their lives. They're going to remember just even those few sentences are going to make that project come alive.
Good stuff from Leslie there. Really good stuff from Leslie.
I mean, I like the fact that she has a pretty tight, focus on this. I do think that most professional services firms fail to understand not just sort of the bigger picture with storytelling, why it's so important, and why not just in the world of sales or marketing it's important, just in everything, but also sort of she's really focused on the tactics as well.
What stood out to me was the way that she positioned stories as showing your differentiators. Whereas, so the example she used was one of our engineers stopped by the building to check on the pipes on Christmas and found a frozen pipe or a leaky pipe or something to that. Yeah. And, that shows that, hey, we don't take those holidays off. We're still working behind the back. You can trust us, right? Just from that little story signals that point of differentiation. So I thought that was an interesting point that she made where, sometimes showing and not saying you're different, showing it through stories is a powerful way to communicate that.
Yeah, it's good. And we've talked about storytelling in the past, mostly, I think, in the episodes related to the client success stories. Mm-hmm. Leslie, I think, talked about a few examples of storytelling. We even favor super short stories. When I talk about client success stories, I'm talking about ones that are, 60 seconds long or, 2 minutes or whatever, that are super fast. I have not just embrace the importance of storytelling in the work that I do with my clients. I have also worked with people who were fantastic storytellers. So I have real life examples. A previous firm I worked with, the figurehead, the face of the organization, was a fantastic storyteller. And it seemed like every client conversation that he had, and I was sort of on the side listening in, ended up being just a series of stories, which it was so powerful because they're so memorable right? You can just, it gets people nodding and engaged in the conversation. So super powerful.
Another takeaway that I had from my conversation with Leslie is the different variations of story length. Like you talked about, like the very short stories, 60-second stories. Sometimes it can be a 2 to 3 page PDF of a client engagement that's written out, a long form podcast conversation with your client recounting many stories that arcs throughout the whole engagement. Or, it could be just one slide on like a webinar presentation where you're just talking about the engagement, or it's got a couple bullet points, key moments. So, there's different flavors and formats that you can use to incorporate storytelling. There's no just one size fits all.
Okay, last but not least on our list today is Perryn Olson. And you've known Perryn, I believe, for some time, right? So Perryn has a great perspective. And you, I think, what sounded like we had a good conversation with Perryn.
Yeah, Perryn and I worked together for a couple of years. He has a focus on construction companies and working with construction companies. He is a fractional CMO that serves the construction space. And he identified what he sees as broken, specifically in the construction space. That's what we focused on, was the founder-led sales and reliance on founder-led sales and how that hinders organizational growth. And then poorly defined ideal client profiles. So not knowing what makes a good client versus a bad client. So those were the two things that Perryn identified as being broken. So it was a really, really interesting conversation.
Good. Well, let's listen in.
Architects and engineers have more of the professional services model that you'd see in a law firm, an accounting firm, things like that, and even maybe in an ad agency marketing firm. Construction doesn't. There's still so much hard bid that's going on and so much negotiated. So their two forms of business development are generally founder-led and then outside business developers, like pure business developers. They're not swinging it. And you still need your project managers. And in the last few years, you've seen this project executive role kind of step up. And it's kind of a step above even being a senior PM, and they're a little bit more the business. And some of the bigger companies have both a project executive and a project manager. The project manager is focused on the schedule and the labor, essentially the budget. And the project executive is essentially in charge of the client, maintaining that client relationship and mentoring those project managers. So you're getting a little bit from the field, but the mid-sized companies to the small companies are definitely more founder-led, and that's a huge issue because as the company grows, essentially that becomes the ceiling, is their founder-led rainmakers. And it's also a huge issue in acquisitions. I was talking to a buddy, he's actually not in construction, but he's struggling because the owner's 90% of business development. He's a business developer. He feels like he's handcuffed. And I'm like, hey, when's your owner want to retire? Sell the company 10, 15 years, like 3. I'm like,
oh shit.
If he doesn't get out the way and build a sales process that doesn't involve him, he's literally hurting his margins, like 3 to 4, maybe 5x multiples, because he is the company. That company is so risky that if he steps out in a year or two, the company falls apart. He's got like 30 employees in this. He's been in the company 15, 20 years, built it all up, but they've never built out the sales and marketing processes to offset him. And I'm like, you're killing your resale value.
Awesome. So good stuff from Perryn. I think he hit on a couple of notes that, Mark, you and I like to talk about, or that we've talked about in the past, specifically transitioning from that founder-led sales model to a more institutional-led sales model. Well, I think we've said democratizing sales across the organization.
Yeah. It is hard. It is one of the hardest things that a founder and an organization can do is empowering more and more people in the organization to go out and find and win new work. And it sounds like it would be a fantastic opportunity, but there's so many forces against it, right? The founder is resistant. Maybe some of the up and comers who are just learning how to do all of this kind of doer seller kind of stuff, maybe they'll go out and screw up. And the founder is dying. The founder is like, no, I have to sweep in and, come in and close the deal. And it's super hard for a founder to make this big leap. So it's understandable why firms struggle with the founder-led sales model.
Another point that Perryn made in that conversation was, and I found this really, really interesting, and it's probably a little bit more true in the AEC world than in other professional service industries, but there's this notion of teaming partners being like competimates, where you're working with them on some projects and you're bidding against them in others, and there's a strange relationship that exists there.
Yeah, I use the term co-opetition.
Co-opetition, there you go.
Right. It's on one project you're cooperating, and another project you're competitors, and it's crazy, and it's understandable how it would come about. Different firms have different little slices of expertise that they can, sort of patchwork together with others to really be able to provide what a client needs. Sometimes it's natural, particularly with firms that have done it a lot and have worked together a lot and know what it means to work well together and, not be stabbing each other in the back. But other times it can be really, really tricky. Some people think it's just the nature of the beast. I would agree with Perryn that it's kind of broken because there's a lot of times there's no rules. It all goes a little sideways sometimes. So yeah, I like it.
Excellent. Well, Mark, this has been a fun way to recap some of the recent conversations that I've had with some of these folks. Like you mentioned at the top of the episode, we do have more that are in the can that will loop into future episodes. And if you have a hot take, maybe a spicy meatball about what's broken about business development in your industry or in your market, shoot me an email. Shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Let me know, and we can schedule a time to get your voice on Breaking BizDev.
Good. I like it, and people are invited to do the same with me as well. John, thanks for taking the time to interview these 3 guest voices who all brought their own little spin on what is broken in business development. So I think it's been a fun episode. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking BizDev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.